It's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Tom Merrill, Professor of Government in the School of Public Affairs at American University. Professor Merrill has been devoted to liberal education throughout his career and through the study of great books, first as a student in the program Fundamentals, Issues, and Texts at the University of Chicago, which has a kinship here, subsequently in his study of political theory at Duke University, in a stint as a tutor here at St. John's, but most of all at American University, and perhaps especially as the director of the Lincoln Scholars Program for first and second year students that offers small seminars on foundational texts. Adjacent to his work with the Lincoln Scholars, he co-directs the Political Theory Institute, which hosts an excellent lecture series, which I could commend to you. Professor Merrill is also an accomplished scholar, co-editor of the Journal of American Political Thought, author of the volume Hume and the Politics of Enlightenment, which was winner of the Delba Winthrop Prize for Best Recent Work in Political Philosophy. This work explores the Socratic character of Hume's activity, passing from metaphysical aporia to political and social reflections. His lecture tonight is entitled Deception and Self-Deception in Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. Please welcome Professor Tom Merrill.
Thank you, Mr. McFarland. I think that's the first time that anyone's ever mentioned the Fundamentals program in introducing to me. And that's because the reason I think that he did that is because he was the director of that at that time. So it's great to be here. I just want to start, this is the part of the remarks that I didn't prepare. It's a great honor for me to be here at St. John's College. As Mr. McFarland mentioned, I help run a program called Lincoln Scholars at American University that tries to take students through a series of core texts in some small seminars. What we do with that program has been very much influenced by the college and by things that I and others who work in the program learn from the college. And so it's really meaningful for me to be able to express my gratitude to the place and to say there are other places in the world that are trying to do similar things. So I just want to say thank you to the college and to the people who make up the college for that. And I also want to say I noticed that there are some of the Lincoln Scholars folks in the audience tonight, and I want to say thank you for being here, and colleagues and students, that it really is meaningful to me. And I should say, you're going to have to tell me if the true meaning of the title of my lecture is deception or self-deception, but you can talk about that in question period. So. The main character of modernity is the bourgeois. In saying this, I'm not thinking of Marx's famous analysis. Rather, I have in mind the root meaning of the word. The bourgeoisie, originally the burghers, the people who live in cities, Pittsburgh or Harrisburg or Edinburgh. City life plays a foundational role in modernity. Cities had existed for a long time, of course, but in the early modern period, cities became the site and the vehicle for a particular kind of culture, the social milieu of the bourgeoisie. To speak impressionistically, the bourgeoisie live in a world of opportunity whose occupants have been liberated from the social norms of the small town and from the vestiges of patriarchy and feudalism. It's a world of commerce in multiple senses: trade, social interaction, travel. It's a world of business and technological progress. By all reports, the bourgeoisie love their gadgets, and so their work tends to be intellectual work rather than manual labor. In addition, they are social people. They spend a lot of time in what we now call third spaces, spaces that are neither the home or the church on the one hand, or the workplace on the other. Think of the coffee shop or the mall. These are spaces in which a person can display him or herself to indeterminate or only partially known others, as one does when one dresses up for a social scene. Hence the importance of fashion and style. Finally, the bourgeoisie are people with rich inner lives. They talk about their feelings and the feelings of others in some mixture of gossip and therapy. The outstanding vehicle for this kind of activity is, of course, the novel. In this light, one could, without too much injustice, describe the bourgeois as a person who, on his or her day off from their knowledge economy job, sits in coffee shops reading novels, Sally Rooney perhaps, about messy emotional situations and showing off their fashionable gadgets in the hopes of being acknowledged by a person at the next table. Except for the bit about Sally Rooney, that sentence would have been as readily intelligible in 1750 as it is today. Yet opinions are mixed about the bourgeoisie and have been from the beginning. One could write the history of modern philosophy, political theory, and literature in terms of the critics of the bourgeoisie, Marx being only one. Of course, many of these critics look, upon examination, suspiciously bourgeois themselves. Indeed, the tradition of bourgeois critics of the bourgeoisie, of bourgeois self-dissatisfaction, is a long and well-trodden one. And this is true of us today, as it has been at many points in the past. Consider for a moment our contemporary situation. Today, we are living through a populist revolt against elites. I leave aside the political consequences of that revolt, about which you all know only too well. According to the commentators, our political polarization is rooted in a sociological polarization, a conflict between different worldviews, social norms, and cultural understandings. On the one side, there are the knowledge economy types, who tend to be university educated and are really somehow concentrated in the universities, economically prosperous, living in urban areas, and inclined to progressive ideas in the political left. On the other, there are people who resent the first group for some mixture of economic, culturally conservative, or moral motives. The self-understanding of the second group strikes me as ill-defined. Is their ultimate goal the triumph of artificial general intelligence in some techno-utopia? Or is it really a return to Christian patriarchy? And would either of those things actually be all that good by themselves? Another question. But their common enemy is clear. However that may be, from the perspective of a scholar of political thought, which is what I am, two things seem clear. First, the knowledge economy worker of today, or what's almost the same thing, the typical person who works in a university, is a recognizable descendant of the bourgeoisie as known to us from modern philosophy and literature from the 1750s forward. And second, since our moment is reactive, anger against elites rather than a common positive agenda, and I think really nobody has a common positive agenda at the moment, our cultural crisis today is essentially another version of the repeated crises of the bourgeoisie that have punctuated the last 3 centuries. We aren't seeing something wholly new. We are seeing a variation on a theme. We might well wonder, why is the moral world of the bourgeoisie subject to recurrent crises? Why does it reliably provoke reactions, resentment, counter-movements? The history of modern politics in the last 3 centuries is littered with attempts to overthrow the bourgeoisie. None of them have succeeded in the long term. Many of them have been blundering, terrifying, and destructive. However, presentism, which is our tendency to allow the thing today to crowd out any longer-term self-awareness, has obscured the historical continuities of our own moment. Our fascination with the crisis of the day distracts us from the fact that our situation is not new. A benefit of the exposure to the tradition that you get at a place like St. John's is that it gives you resources for reflection, access to perspectives other than one's own. Tonight, I want to think with you about one such perspective. First published in 1759 with significant revisions and additions in 1790, Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, and I'm going to refer to it as TMS, provides something like a portrait of the moral universe of the bourgeoisie, the city dwellers. TMS famously offers us an account of morality based on sympathetic imagination. Secular, tolerant, and transparent, sympathetic morality seems to require only our spontaneous ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others in our imagination, and to, quote, feel their pain. Such an account seems to sidestep the messy controversies about moral foundations that have bedeviled the philosophical and theological traditions of the West. And I think for these reasons, many commentators have been attracted to Smith's sympathetic morality. However, a closer look at Smith's text reveals a more complicated story. Far from being simply transparent, the moral world of modernity is shot through with deception, self-deception, and opacity of several different kinds. Indeed, Smith's text is punctuated by crises in which the limits of transparency and of sympathetic morality are revealed. One suggestion I want to make tonight is that these crises provide a kind of narrative structure to the book. A story is being told, an education is being provided, Smith's education of the reader. Tonight I'm going to discuss what I take to be the turning point of that education in 2 episodes of TMS, a crisis and a kind of resolution. I guess that's a question whether or not it's a resolution. In its final version, TMS has 7 parts. Parts 1, 2, and 3 each have a roughly similar structure. Positive portrait of the moral life, followed by a discovery of a crisis or serious tension within the moral life. In parts 1 and 2, the crisis happens at the end of the part, but part 3 depicts a more serious crisis and consequently has a more complicated structure. In part 4, Smith takes a step back to offer reflections on the complicated relationship between the beautiful and the good in moral life. The theme turns out to be beneficent deceptions, what I'm going to call generative errors. Then parts 5, 6, and 7 all offer ways of working out or living with the insights gained in part 4. Part 4 is the turning point of the book. Part 6, which I'm not going to discuss tonight, is the peak. Such, at any rate, is my understanding of how the book works. Tonight, after some preliminaries, I'm going to be looking at part 3, the most serious crisis, and part 4, Smith's reflection on the crisis, and as I say, the turning point of the book. I should say in advance that part 4 does not exactly offer an answer to the crisis, but represents a kind of reorientation of the inquiries. Some questions that had not been seen before become prominent in that part. It's a kind of turning things upside down. And then I'm going to offer some thoughts about what Smith might mean by all of this. There is a handout with diagrams and tables illustrating my various takes. In case you get bored listening to me drone on, you can look at the handout, which I will refer to at several points throughout the lecture. I do hope that my interpretation of the text will shed some light on the proclivity of the bourgeois world to crisis, to what you might call the inner instability of the modern moral world, and so have some relevance to our situation. 2 caveats before I begin. As befits a commentator of the bourgeoisie, Smith is a very literary writer. He pursues his thoughts through story, anecdote, and vignette, rather than formal argumentation. I like to think that the dramatic situations that appear on almost every page of TMS are the seeds of potential novels, some of which will remind you of real novels or other dramas. I'll point some of these out as we go. Second, you should also know that even though I will be using the terms bourgeoisie, city dwellers, and modern morality, which are all synonyms in my usage, Smith himself does not use these terms. I don't think that my usage is misleading about the essentials. I use these terms as a kind of literary device to highlight the narrative thread, what I take to be the narrative thread of the text, and draw out its dramatic structure. For you see, I too am writing a kind of novel. Before I discuss the 2 episodes of TMS that are my main objects tonight, I need to take care of some preliminaries. First, I'm going to give a brief discussion of how sympathy works, according to Smith, and then I'm going to say something about the structure of the book and how that works. Sympathy is Smith's opening move in the book. He typically refers to it as the ability to put ourselves in the situation of another, or, quote, to enter, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person with him. The sympathetic imagination allows us to bring the experiences of another home to ourselves, and his initial examples all have to do with someone in pain or danger. Smith thinks that the ability to sympathize is the condition of, or the raw materials for, moral life. To make his idea about sympathy more concrete, I mentioned 4 characteristics of sympathy. First, despite a common impression, sympathy for Smith is not primarily concerned with compassion and pity. Rather, he understands it as an active imagination, whereby we put ourselves in the place of another, regardless of the emotions or situation of that other. We engage in an active sympathetic imagination with a person at whom we are angry and want to punish, just as much as with a person who is suffering. Second, being sympathetic for Smith means that we are inherently normative. This does not mean that we're spontaneously good or moral. Rather, it means that we spontaneously take sides, have heroes and villains, praise and blame actions and characters. Third, our sympathetic imagination has a narrative structure. It rarely, if ever, takes only a single thing in isolation from all else. It wants to know, how did we get here, who did what to whom, who is responsible for this, and so forth. Fourth, in our acts of sympathetic imagination, in our acts of sympathetic imagining, we are moved by a desire for correspondence of our sentiments and opinions with the sentiments and opinions of others with whom we sympathize. Though this desire is often thwarted, for Smith it runs throughout moral life. This implies that we do not simply put ourselves in the place of others, we are also somehow aware of ourselves in doing so. In our imaginations, we are always checking to see that the sentiments and opinions of others match or correspond to our own. And note that for Smith, sympathy includes both discursive content, opinions or assertions, and emotions or feelings. As mentioned, Smith's account of the sympathetic imagination has a literary character. Smith sees us as storytelling creatures for whom the imagination is an essential way in which we relate to the world. Smith's account suits the world of the novel that would be so important right down to our own time. And I think there's much to recommend Smith's account as a matter of just describing our own experience of the world. We do, I think, live in our imaginations, and we do seek some kind of correspondence with others, however often that desire is thwarted. However, there's already a problem implicit in Smith's account of sympathy, and this develops very, very early in TMS. Smith suggests that we sympathize even with the dead. And he goes on to describe, in the first 2 pages of the book, in some detail what it would like to be dead. To be deprived of the light of the sun, shut out from life and conversation, trapped in a grave, prey to decay, and being consumed by worms. But none of these things, Smith points out, can actually affect the dead. The dead are, after all, dead. What we are, in fact, doing is imagining ourselves living in the place of the corpse, dead. Here's Smith. The idea of that dreary and endless melancholy which the fancy naturally ascribes to their condition arises altogether from our joining to the change which has been produced upon them, our own consciousness of that change, from our putting ourselves into that situation, and from our lodging, if I may be allowed to say so, our own living souls in their inanimate bodies, and thence conceiving what would be our own emotions in this case. In this vignette, the sympathetic imagination does not provide us any kind of transparent access to the inner life of the other. Quite the opposite. Despite the vividness of the image of ourselves as a corpse in a grave, that image is, as Smith remarks, an illusion of the imagination. The image is a strange mixture, an amalgam of the externals or the surface of the corpse with our own inwardness, our own living souls. And it's this amalgam image, the product of our imaginations, that we are in some strange sense sympathizing with. You might be tempted to dismiss this vignette as a morbid curiosity, but I suspect that this is not a marginal case for Smith's theory of sympathy, but the paradigm case. It shows us what happens in every case of sympathetic imagining. That is, 2 things are going on when we sympathize with the dead or with anything else. On the one hand, we see a thing, in this case the corpse, and form an image of it in our minds. On the other, without being fully aware of it, we somehow imaginatively project ourselves into the image, and then somehow mistake this image, the amalgam, for the original, or what you might call the bare image. Smith seems to think that this happens whenever we sympathize or imagine anything. Sympathy is a matter of, to be blunt, is a matter of revivifying corpses, or rather animating mere things, externals, with our imagination. And there is, of course, a novel about revivifying corpses. It's Frankenstein. One could depict this graphically. Despite our impression, Smith's account is not one of unmediated access to another, where we can see into one another's hearts, as depicted on diagram 1 on the handout. Rather, Smith means the more complicated relationship depicted in diagram 2. But if this is right, deception is baked into the images we use to think about the world. And that deception is a self-deception, since we ourselves have done it without being fully aware of it. Consider this. When we say that the sympathetic imagination allows us to, quote, put ourselves in the imagination of another, that could mean that we're expanding our horizons, gaining access to the perspective of another. But it could also mean that we are thrusting ourselves into the role of the other, displacing the genuine perspective of that other. What is it really like to be a corpse anyway? Perhaps in the dramas in our minds, the self plays all the roles, wearing all the costumes in turn. I hasten to add that Smith is not, I think, providing a simply solipsistic account of our moral lives. If the account just given is correct, we will all come to social life with images that are formally similar to the images that other people have, but to which we have attached quite different ideas. But since we also seek correspondence between each other's sentiments and opinions, through conversation and social interaction. Through jostling and bumping up against each other's ideas, we eventually construct some equilibrium image. And Smith has some beautiful descriptions of this. An image that suits no individual perfectly, but is somehow workable or usable for all. Smith often uses musical terms to explain what he means. While we human beings typically won't be unions with each other, that is, won't be playing exactly the same note, we can have concords, notes that work together. And this is all that can be expected in social life. But note that within the concord, there's already a thread of opacity, right, of things that don't match. For Smith, the image of social life is human beings who have words in common, but very different, even contradictory ideas attached to those words, stumbling in a chaotic, sometimes frustrating way to find some way of communicating with each other. It's been a while since I've been here at the college, and so I'm not sure how your seminars are, but that's a pretty good description of freshman seminars, I hate to say that for the people in the front, at my institution. So I just want to note that. Now I want to tell you something about the structure of TMS to prepare for our two big episodes. As you can see in Table 1 on the handout, parts 1, 2, and 3 of TMS each show a parallel pattern, and I think it's really striking. First, we get a topic, an aspect of the moral life that Smith treats quite positively. But then there turns out to be a crisis or a problem in the moral life related to the topic of that part. In part 1, the topic is the idea of propriety or appropriateness as the fundamental category of morality, and the problem is the widespread human tendency to look up to and unreflectively obey the rich and powerful. In part 2, the topic is merit and demerit, things that deserve reward and punishment. And the problem is that despite our best intentions, our moral sentiments turn out to be shaped or warped by fortune and chance. In both of those parts, the problem comes up at the end of the part. In part 3, however, the underlying issue is more complicated. Consequently, the structure is more involved. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. The overall effect of the pattern linking parts 1, 2, and 3 is a deepening sense of crisis, I think. Smith spirals. He raises a topic, is troubled by it, leaves it, and then comes back to a similar, maybe more problematic topic. It's almost like he's mustering his courage, or perhaps preparing the reader to confront the dilemmas of part 3. I mentioned one example from these early parts to help explain what Smith has in mind and to give you some context for what's about to come. In part one, Smith tells us that we human beings have the unfortunate tendency to admire, even sometimes to worship, the rich and powerful. We confuse the rich and powerful with the wise and virtuous. And correspondingly, to ignore or fail to notice the poor. In the world of sympathy, attention is power. We do so, he thinks, without any thought to our own benefit. We are swept up by the beautiful dream which we think is the lifestyles of the rich and famous. That's not a novel, but that is a TV show that some of us used to watch. We fall in love with the rich and famous, and we fall hard. Even when these people are, objectively speaking, bad for us. The paradigm example that Smith gives of this is Louis XIV, the Sun King of France and the would-be universal monarch of Europe. The adulation of a Louis is both misguided, since he doesn't deserve it, and bad for us, since it weakens our backbone, our willingness to stand up to bad or foolish authority. Smith is less interested in the details of bad government than he is in the causes, why we human beings are fascinated by the powerful, why we thoughtlessly hand ourselves over to them. Now, in the 19th century, commentators like Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill devoted, as much as many of you here will know, much attention to the intellectual tyranny of the majority and the social tyranny of the majority, I think synonymous terms. I suggest to you that Smith is anticipating those later discussions. He's thinking about the same kind of thing, pointing out to us a disquieting but persistent aspect of the moral world of the bourgeoisie. Now it's time to turn to the first of the two episodes that I want to discuss tonight. This is what I'm calling the crisis that we find in part 3 of TMS. As I mentioned, part 3 is complicated both argumentatively and structurally, and I'm going to have to leave a lot out of my discussion tonight. I'm going to start by describing the shape and structure of the part, and then digging deeper into the dramatic situation at the heart of part 3, which I'm going to call the fall of the impartial spectator. According to its title, the themes of part 3 of TMS are self-knowledge and moral duty. Smith begins by articulating the moral life as seen from the inside. He begins this part by articulating the moral life seen from the inside, in light of its aspirations as well as its reality. He tells us that we care not just about being praised, but about being praiseworthy. Not coincidentally, the figure of the impartial spectator becomes especially prominent at the beginning of part 3. I think the impartial spectator is actually quite closely related to the problem of justice and resentment, but maybe we could talk about that in question period. The impartial spectator is the point of view that we imply or assume when we attribute objectivity to moral judgments. It helps us understand how human beings can critique their own emotions and actions in light of what they think should be the case, as opposed to what simply is the case. There's a problem in the moral world of part 3, however, what Smith calls the problem of unmerited reproach, which is a strange phrase, and I'll try to explain it. The problem of unmerited reproach arises when an innocent person is accused of a crime they didn't commit and cannot prove their innocence. Smith's example is the case of Jean Calas, who was a French Calvinist who was accused, convicted, and executed for the murder of his son, which we are told he did not commit. I'm not quite sure how we know that he didn't commit it, but this is a famous story that is well known to Smith's audience. Smith thinks that such cases bother us, and bother us a lot. These are cases in which not only a judge, but your friends and loved ones believe you to be guilty of not simply a terrible, but a shameful crime. A situation in which there's literally no one else to appeal to. The problem, to my mind, is clearly reminiscent of Glaucon's speech from Book 2 of Plato's Republic, and it raises questions like, do we care about justice for its own sake or only for its consequences? What happens when innocence loses everything in the face of error, folly, and injustice? Is there any cosmic or divine support for justice, any afterlife or the like? All of this is literally on the surface of Smith's text. And do our answers to these questions make any difference to how we understand and live the moral life? In part 3 of TMS, Smith is troubled by, or wants to trouble his readers with, these questions. He comes back to them almost obsessively 3 times by my count, and with basically the same pattern each time, as you can see in Table 2 on the handout. First, he gives an account of the nobility of moral life, that, i.e., that we care not just about praise, but praiseworthiness. Then he raises the problem of unmerited reproach or the vulnerability of the moral life. Then he suggests that the existence of the afterlife, if we knew that it existed, would resolve the problem. And then he suggests that despite its benefits in supporting moral life through the doctrine of the afterlife, religion brings other social and political problems with it. The pattern is quite clear, I think, and it's striking that he does the same thing in multiple times. This is clearly heavy stuff. Smith circles around these issues, raising them, leaving them, coming back to them, and that's part of the reason why the structure of Part 3 is so complicated. And he leaves key issues unresolved. It's not entirely clear, and intelligent readers have disagreed. If you want to talk about Smith literature, if it's not entirely clear if Smith means to assert the truth of the doctrine of the afterlife or only wants to say that such a doctrine would resolve the problem if we knew it were true. And at one point he refers to, quote, a virtuous man who has had the misfortune to doubt the reality of the afterlife, but who nonetheless wishes it were true. And near the end of Part 3, he's going to report an impassioned speech of one Bishop of Clermont, denouncing a God who would allow the innocent to suffer and the evil to prosper as a tyrant. It's a very strange passage in TMS that I commend to your attention that I'm not going to try to interpret tonight. That speech, too, is the seed of a novel, a Dostoevskian Russian atheistic novel, I think. Smith raises it and leaves it. I'm telling you this as a way of setting the stage for the part of Smith's story that I'm most interested in tonight. Let me go back to the impartial spectator. Smith calls the impartial spectator the man within or the man within the breast. The impartial spectator allows us to correct or resist the judgments of the man without, the morally dubious world of actual human beings. However, in cases of unmerited reproach or other similar cases, the impartial spectator finds it hard to maintain an independent stance. Smith writes, but in this and in some other cases, the man within seems sometimes, as it were, astonished and confounded by the vehemence and clamor of the man without. The violence and loudness with which blame is sometimes poured out upon us seems to stupefy and benumb our natural sense of praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. We scarce dare to absolve ourselves when all our brethren appear loudly to condemn us. The supposed impartial spectator of our conduct seems to give his opinion in our favor with fear and hesitation, when that of all the real spectators is unanimously and violently against us. In such cases, the demigod within the breast appears like the demigods of the poets, though partly of immortal, yet partly too of mortal extraction. When his judgments are steadily and firmly directed by the sense of praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, he seems to act suitably to his divine extraction. But when he suffers himself to be astonished and confounded by the judgments of ignorant and weak men, he discovers his connection with mortality and appears to act suitably rather to the human than to the divine part of his origin. I think this is perhaps the saddest passage in TMS. The impartial spectator expresses our moral aspirations to arise above our self-interest and narrow, human, all too human perspective. It expresses an aspiration to a kind of divinity. Yet at this moment of crisis, when all voices are against us and we stand alone, the impartial spectator collapses. The demigod turns out to have a mortal as well as an immortal side, and the mortal side, the human side, is stronger. This is the fall of the impartial spectator and the essential, as I interpreted, the essential crisis of Part 3. The stakes are high. What we're witnessing is the collapse of a human being's conscience. Smith responds to the crisis by raising the question of the afterlife, although, as I mentioned, inconclusively or ambiguously. I don't mean to dismiss that question, but given my limited time tonight, I want to go back a step and ask, why exactly is the problem with unmerited reproach such a problem for us human beings, according to Smith? Why does Smith think that it strikes us to the quick, He clearly does. He spends pages and pages talking about under what circumstances we can be sure of our judgments and what circumstances other people's disagreement make us doubt our judgments. So it seems really important. After all, one might interpret situations like unjust reproach as terrible misfortunes without seeing them as fundamental attacks on our identity and sense of moral dignity. Now, it's a striking fact that it's precisely the good among us, according to Smith, that is, the people who want to see themselves as good people, who are especially vulnerable to the problem of unmerited reproach. It's these people, as opposed to hardened criminals, who can be shamed, who care about the opinion of others. Even in cases where they know full well that they're innocent, they can still be cut by other people believing them capable of crimes. Why should this be the case? Smith answers this question in this way. When a man refuses the merits which is ascribed to him, that would be unjust praise, no one doubts his veracity. It may be doubted when he denies the crime which he is accused of. He is at once enraged at the falsehood of the imputation and mortified to find that any credit should be given it. He feels that his character is not sufficient to protect him. He feels that his brethren, far from looking upon him in that light in which he anxiously desires to be viewed by them, think him capable of being guilty of what he is accused of. He knows perfectly that he has not been guilty. He knows perfectly what he has done, but perhaps scarce any man can know perfectly what he himself is capable of. What the peculiar constitution of his own mind may or may not admit is perhaps more or less a matter of doubt to every man. The trust and good opinion of his friends and neighbors tends more than anything to relieve him from this most disagreeable doubt, their distrust and unfavorable opinion to increase it. I think this is an amazing paragraph. The issue behind unmerited reproach is not whether you actually committed a crime or not. You could resolve that in an actual court of law. Yes or no, did you do it? It's rather that the person in question cannot be sure that they are not the kind of person who could have committed the crime. Perhaps deep in our psyches, there is some part of us that could commit crimes, that desires to commit crimes. And I'm reminded, this is perhaps too lighthearted, I'm reminded here of that Agatha Christie novel in which the narrator reveals on the very last page of the book that he has in fact been the murderer all along. It's a wonderful novel. It's like a wonderful example of, as good as you could get in Agatha Christie craft. I'm not going to tell you the title because I don't want to ruin it for you, but it's a twist, right? Back to Smith. Put differently, the real issue behind unmerited reproach is our inability to know ourselves fully and completely. I take it that Smith thinks that this is true about human beings generally. We do not have full access to ourselves. We're dimly aware of that. And that awareness accounts for our vulnerability to accusations and to unmerited reproach, false accusations and unmerited reproach. Here, Smith touches on phenomena that could be developed into a theory of the unconscious, Freudian or otherwise. Now, if you think, as I do, that in TMS, Smith is giving us a portrait of the moral world, the moral psychology of the bourgeoisie, the city dwellers, we can ask, what does all this tell us about us, bourgeoisie? Because we are also city dwellers. Deep in the moral psychology of the bourgeoisie, there is, it seems, if interpreting this passage, there is a basic insecurity, a kind of existential anxiety, a wavering about core tenets of the self's identity. That insecurity explains why Smith's moral agents are so vulnerable to unjust accusations. It presumably also helps explain why those moral agents are liable to fall hard for the Louis XIVs of the world, and helps explain the powerful tendency to social conformity noted by Tocqueville and Mill and many others since. Smith writes, quote, "The agreement or disagreement, both of the sentiments and the judgments of other people with our own, is in all cases of more or less importance to us, exactly in proportion as we ourselves are more or less uncertain about the propriety of our own sentiments, about the accuracy of our own judgments. The bourgeoisie are so tempted by conformity, it would seem, because deep down they don't really know who they are. Before I turn to part 4, our second and last episode tonight, I want to say something, I want to reflect for a moment on what's just happened in part 3 and how part 3 works in the overall structure of TMS. You'll forgive me, I know all of this sort of reading stuff may not be immediately gripping, but it's how I think about books and how I learn from books. I'm interested in how Smith has constructed his narrative as an author. I think part 3 takes the world of sympathetic morality with which TMS begins to its limit. The problem of unmerited reproach is the Achilles heel of sympathetic morality, the one weak spot against which sympathetic morality has no defense. Recall that sympathetic morality came to light as based purely on humanity and based on human imagination and fellow feeling, with no need for controversial theological or metaphysical claims. It allowed and allows the bourgeois to feel good about themselves as high-minded moral people without having to wrestle with messy foundational questions. Part 3 inverts this starting point in 2 ways. First, it shows that sympathetic morality is not and cannot be self-contained. It necessarily relies on, or at least points to, theological or cosmological issues. Smith has got a beautiful quote, and he says, in many cases, our happiness in this life is dependent on what we think about the happiness in the next. So far as I can see, Smith does not even claim to resolve the doubts or questions that one might have about those issues. For an adequate response, one would presumably have to insert the entire philosophical theological tradition. It's not a small task. Second, part 3 shows that a morality whose foundation is the opinion of others is essentially unstable, ultimately indistinguishable from mere conformity. And that's incompatible with what we generally mean by morality. Given all this, you might expect Smith to pick right up by launching into cosmological or theological inquiries to address the questions that have come to light. And this he does not do. Instead, we get part 4 of TMS. The theme of part 4 is the place of the beautiful in human life, and especially its complicated relationship to the human good. In part 4, Smith makes 2 basic claims. First, we human beings have a concern with beauty, and synonyms for beauty for Smith include system, order, and nobility, that is independent of and often contrary to our immediate interest. He doesn't think that we're looking to get paid. He thinks that we fall in love with things genuinely. We human beings are essentially lovers, moved by visions of beauty. And second, that the beauty that we are aiming at is often, always, it's not clear from the text, maybe somebody can help me with this, is often deceptive. What we think we are aiming at is not what we get, according to part 4. But the actions we undertake in pursuit of the vision of the beautiful turns out to have good consequences, indeed consequences that are indispensable for human life as we know it. They're just not the ones that we thought we were going to get when we fell in love. I call this class of phenomenon generative errors, and I think that the thought is at the very heart of Smith's understanding of human beings. That's not to say that I completely understand what he thinks about that, but I'm sure that this is like ground zero in some important way. The story that Smith tells to explain this thought is the story of a figure he calls the poor man's son. The poor man's son is a classic story of a striver, a try-hard, a very familiar character in the bourgeois world. The story begins with the poor man's son, whom Smith says, heaven in its anger has visited with ambition, admiring the condition of the rich and powerful. He compares his father's humble cottage with the palaces of the great and is swept away by a vision of the ease and luxury made possible by wealth and power. He's a daydreamer. Many of us bourgeois are daydreamers. Quote, enchanted with a distant idea of this felicity. It appears in his fancy, this is a quote, it appears in his fancy like the life of some superior rank of beings. And in order to arrive at it, he devotes himself forever to the pursuit of wealth and greatness. Paradoxically, for the sake of future ease and repose, that house in the suburbs, he sacrifices all present ease and repose. Quote, to obtain the conveniences which wealth and power afford, he submits in the first year, nay, in the first month of his application, to more fatigue of body and more uneasiness of mind than he could have suffered through the whole of his life from the want of them. And eventually the poor man's son succeeds. He acquires the wealth and power that he covets. The story doesn't end well for our hero, however. Having achieved wealth and greatness, he discovers that he has acquired only the image of what he wanted. Quote, it's then in the last dregs of life, his body wasted with toil and diseases, his mind galled and ruffled by the memory of 1,000 injuries and disappointments, which he imagines he has met with from the injustice of his enemies or from the perfidy and ingratitude of his friends. That he begins at last to find that wealth and greatness are mere trinkets of frivolous utility. That's an important phrase. If you're reading that part, Smith uses that phrase, trinkets of frivolous utility, several times. More troublesome to him who carries them about with him than all the advantages they can afford him are commodious. And this, of course, is a very familiar story. We all know this story. The sad or the miserable tycoon, think of Gatsby or Citizen Kane. Or to be honest, when I go to the grocery store and I pick up People magazine, right, that's effectively the story that's being told, like some version of that along that trajectory. And I love it. I read it. That's what I do at the grocery store. Smith doesn't tell the story, I think, as a moralistic critique of the poor man's son, though the story certainly appeals to his readers' envy at success. Nor are we supposed to take the poor man's son as a fully reliable judge of his own experience, either in his earlier enthusiastic phase or his later bitter stage. More on that in a moment. Smith tells the story because it reveals something fundamental about human beings generally. His point is that this kind of mistake is widely, perhaps universally shared. What's more, and this is the shocking thing, the thing that we really associate with Smith. Those errors are good, beneficial, have good consequences for us human beings, collectively, if not individually. Here's Smith again. And it is well that nature imposes on us in this manner. It is this deception which rouses and keeps in motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life, which have entirely changed the whole face of the globe, have turned the rude forests of nature into agreeable and fertile plains, and made the trackless and barren ocean a new fund of subsistence, and the great high road of communication for the different nations of the world. I'm going to note parenthetically that Smith here is quoting his own translation of a passage from Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality. Make of that what you will. It's a fact. The thought is that we human beings, some human beings, all human beings, are moved by visions of beauty that move them to spend themselves, to spend their time, energy, perhaps even their lives doing big things. Smith has in view heroic types, founders, scientists, poets, artists, political reformers. He thinks political reformers are all moved by some vision of beauty that may not be good for the people they're trying to reform. These are the people who create and sustain the human world, physically, by making nature fit for human habitation, and culturally, by shaping the stories, the mores, the norms that make human life together possible. And the heroes are lovers. That's very clear, I think, for Smith. The heroes are lovers, moved by an idea of, quote, something grand and beautiful and noble. Expressed graphically, Smith's understanding of nature's deception looks like diagram 3 on the handout. Now, Smith says that there's a deception involved in this whole class of human action, but we should ask, what exactly is this deception? What precisely? And Smith gives several different examples. I think it's like 7 or 9 or something, and they differ in important ways. It's something we could talk about. So what exactly is the deception? Part of the answer is that these heroes of the human world are moved by visions that can never be fully realized. Certainly big-name people love to say this kind of thing, that well, I did something that was impossible, right? It may also be the case that, like the poor man's son, these characters believe that they will attain the status of some superior rank of beings, immune from the realities of suffering and death. Be that as it may, Smith is clear that these characters do accomplish things the rest of us benefit from, just not the things they thought they were accomplishing. Even the poor man's son, it seems, does good things for society, though he seems not to be aware of it. Smith tells us, and I'm conflating two passages, but I think I'm getting the thought across accurately. Smith tells us that, quote, the proud and unfeeling landlord, who I think is a parallel to the poor man's son, who consumes in his imagination the whole harvest of his land, he wants to imagine himself owning everything and consuming it, is nonetheless compelled to share the produce of that land. He can only eat so much, Smith says in a famous passage. The rest he is obliged to distribute among those who prepare that little which he himself makes use of, among those who fit up the palace in which this little is consumed, among those who provide and keep in order all the different baubles and trinkets, that word again, which are employed in the economy of greatness, all of whom thus derive from his luxury and caprice that share of the necessaries of life which they would in vain have expected from his humanity or his justice. The rich are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interests of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. There's lots of complications in that passage we could talk about. Somebody should write a paper about it. This is the famous invisible hand, which appears only twice, despite the fact that it's so famous. It only appears twice in Smith's published works, once here and once in The Wealth of Nations. The invisible hand is another name, I think, for nature's deception. I think we could define it, at least the way that Smith uses it, as the ratio between what we think we're doing and what we're actually doing. It's a kind of measure of our own self-ignorance. The deception here is that the proud and unfeeling landlord is aiming at an image of total possession, but that image is both impossible and, even if possible, would not produce happiness for the person in question. What the proud and unfeeling landlord does produce is the homely and almost unnoticed good of what we would call today economic opportunity. It's a familiar thought even today that vanity is the engine of commerce. I'm sure all of you have had that thought. I want to take stock of this argument and then offer some thoughts about what Smith is trying to get at. These are famous, complicated passages that Smith commentators have a hard time nailing down. The kinds of deceptions or self-deceptions that we see in The Poor Man's Son or The Proud and Unfeeling Landlord, you might call those narrowly economic deceptions. That's not quite the right phrase, but you understand what I mean. They're important, but they're definitely not the whole of the phenomenon Smith is concerned with in Part 4. Smith's later reputation as the first of the political economists obscures this fact from us. And I think when you read TMS, you have to imagine that he had never written that other book, right? Like, how would the world look? Right? We often read it back, but he finds the basic structure of the beautiful as a beautiful deception in a range of phenomena, including political founding, science, art, and so on. And I'm just going to note, for those of you who might go home and reread the book, that Smith has been preparing this theme of beneficial deception or generative error from very early on in TMS, that if you read it, once you've read it the first time, you go back and you read it the second time, you say, oh, I see that this theme has been anticipated several times earlier in the book. Indeed, every one of the major passages about deception and errors in parts 1 through 3 discusses the useful consequences of those errors. So it seems to be very important for Smith. Now, this is my interpretation. Smith's take is, I think, an essentially comic portrait of moral life. The thought of the vain rich man unintentionally benefiting his fellows is funny in a grim, characteristically Smithian way. It points to the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are, the gap between aspiration and reality. And it's comic, notwithstanding the fact that genuine grief and sadness are present, as the story of the poor man's son shows. We might still ask, however, where does Smith stand? Where do we readers stand in this human comedy? And I think this is really the hard part about the text. Have we attained a vantage point outside of the human drama, free of delusion and error? Does Smith want us to say, with Shakespeare's Puck, what fools these mortals be, and leave it at that? After the terrible drama of part 3, I think that stance would be hard to maintain. Smith is cryptic on these points, so all we can do is speculate. Here's how I interpret his meaning. Note the phrasing of the sentence about nature's deception, and it is well that nature imposes on us, that's the word I want to emphasize, is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. Us is a pronoun that includes the speaker and the reader. Smith does not have in view only those cases he discusses explicitly, the poor man's son and so on, but includes us readers in his claim. And you might elaborate this thought as follows. For Smith, the beautiful is not solely or even primarily a moral, political, or economic theme, but an epistemological one. The beautiful tells us something about how we stand with regard to the world or things in the world as such. Let me explain what this might mean by going back to diagram 2 on your handout. Super useful. According to Smith, when we sympathize with or think about something, we sympathize with an image that is an amalgam, a mixture of the external appearance of the person or thing that we are looking at and some part of ourselves that we've projected onto that appearance. We see ourselves, but in a costume. The part of the image that comes from the thing itself and the part that comes from us are not easy to disentangle. Smith's schema implies that there is a dark side of the thing that we're sympathizing with or thinking about that we do not have direct access to, but that somehow we know or have good reason to think is there. In diagram 2, that would be the internal life of the person or the lack of the internal life, in the case of the dead person, with whom we sympathize with. In diagram 3, it would be the political, social, and economic goods produced by the pursuit of an unreal image of the beautiful. If this is right, there's no thinking without the beautiful or without images. It would mean that we human beings have a kind of double vision of the world in the sense that any image both is and is not the thing that it seems to be. The trick would be to take the image seriously for what we can learn from it while not forgetting that it is an image and therefore misleading. What difference would an awareness of nature's deceptions make for the moral dramas of TMS? For the poor man's son, or indeed for the victim of unjust reproach? Well, it seems to me that it does make a difference if you're aware that we live in a world of images. It gives you a potential source of resistance to getting carried away by the image. In the case of the poor man's son, it might help you navigate the transition from the initial naive enthusiasm to the later bitterness. At least you wouldn't be completely surprised when things didn't live up to what you thought they were going to be. But I think there's something deeper here as well. The problem of the image, as Smith discusses it, is that the image is the product of the expectations we bring to a thing without being fully aware of it. Smith's account of the beautiful, therefore, points to or calls for self-critique and self-analysis, some version of the examined life. What baggage am I bringing to my experience? What hopes, what fears, what inarticulate longings are shaping what I see in the world? The process of self-examination implied by Smith's analysis would certainly not be easy and perhaps not finishable in the duration of a human life, but it might help us avoid some particular errors. For example, the poor man's son might discover that his life, his original plan for his life, was based on an unstated belief that wealth and power can protect you from suffering. And it would be good for him to have known that, or at least to have had that thought presented to him before he embarked on his crusade. The case of a victim of unjust reproach is more complicated. Smith thinks that cases of unjust reproach are manifestly major misfortunes, and as such worthy of grief. But the identity crisis that he describes is something different and more intimate. Doesn't that crisis reveal an unhealthy dependence on the opinion of others, a dependence more disturbing because it is usually cast in the language of niceness and agreeability. It's a very common thing in our world. We avoid the hard questions by being nice or by being agreeable. And doesn't that dependence reveal a deeper unwillingness or inability to confront the self, to be honest about the self, to the extent that we can be honest about the self? These, I think, are the riddles with which Smith's text leaves us. I come to my conclusion. Crudely stated, the action of TMS is to take the moral sensibility of the bourgeois world and probe it until that sensibility experiences a crisis, the crisis of part 3. Smith makes us ask questions like, is the moral life supported or protected by anything outside of itself in nature or God? Is there anything in human beings that allows them to resist the pressure of conformity from the outside? Whatever we make of the teaching of part 4, I don't think that we should rush to answer these questions too quickly. Smith helps explain why the bourgeoisie are susceptible to intellectual conformity and fads, and consequently oblivious to other perspectives in the world. And I take it that even today, these are legitimate grounds of dissatisfaction with the bourgeoisie and resistance to them. And of course, there are other far less defensible grounds of anger at the bourgeoisie, but that's another story from the one I'm telling tonight. From this point of view, it would be all to the good to have the bourgeoisie jolted out of their self-absorption. I think we could go past that, a kind of smugness, by confronting them with certain existential questions that they really should have thought through, should have an answer to. And so, I'm tempted to end my lecture there. However, that would leave you with a misleading impression about what I mean. So I'm going to conclude with 2 final points. The first is a remark about Smith's position. To point out the existence of deceptions, as Smith repeatedly does, I think implies that knowing the truth is good, even if the truth that is known is unattractive, and even if one grants that we cannot get rid of deceptions in general. The barely stated premise of TMS, I suggest, is that self-knowledge and clarity about the human situation is good for human beings. And this may well be the inner meaning of the title of the book. The theory of moral sentiments is a theory, not in the sense of a deduction from first principles, that would be a theory of justice, the book, but in the sense of a viewing, a contemplation. The theory of moral sentiments is not a theory, the theory of moral sentiments is not a theory, it is a viewing of, an attempt to give an accurate assessment of moral sentiments. And I think that this point has a moral ethical dimension in Smith's mind. When he finally gets around to saying what he thinks virtue is, it turns out to be a combination of the ability to see the world clearly, on the one hand, and self-command, the ability to make necessary sacrifices for one's own good, on the other. In turn, clarity about the world provides or might provide a ground from which to resist the pressure of conformity. Smith remarks that while a wise man cares about just fame, right, the wise man is not simply immune to considerations of reputation, his own self-approbation, quote, stands in need of no confirmation from the approbation of other men. Clarity of vision in no way provides immunity to misfortune, including the misfortune of unjust reproach, but it might be a ground for our own self-respect. As for my second concluding point, I hesitate to make it. I think that Miss Manners says somewhere, or should have said somewhere, that it's bad form to praise the Athenians in Athens and the Johnnies at St. John's. But this is the point I have to make, and here we are. So here it is. It seems to me that Smith's account of the generative error of the beautiful points to our continuing need for something like liberal education. In part 4, Smith implies that there are 2 parts or phases to our intellectual life. First, we fall in love with some beautiful vision of a thing which we know or can know in advance is partly right and partly wrong. And then we have to go through a process of reasoning it out, of separating the beautiful vision out into its constituent parts, criticizing it. For Smith, we make progress in that process, but we never seem to escape it. Now, I think of the central practice of liberal education. The model seminar has 2 elements, a text and a conversation. The text is some morally complicated, well-crafted work of art that raises fundamental questions about human life and that resists easy summary. The conversation has a leader but no expert and is intentionally open-ended. It necessarily has an element of anarchy within it. Now, liberal education, as I understand it, needs both elements, the text and the conversation. Without the conversation, we would stand before the text in inarticulate awe, our mouths gaping like mere tourists, a stance hardly conducive to moral agency or thoughtfulness. Without the text, our conversation would be about nothing, like Seinfeld, a quasi-novel, I would say, and our conversation would go in all directions and none. I suggest that the liberal education seminar attempts to give institutional form to something like what Smith is trying to say about the role of the beautiful in our lives. We human beings need beautiful things. At least we, in fact, find some things beautiful, fascinating, awe-inspiring, a fact that needs an acknowledged place in our collective self-understanding, a place which it perhaps does not have in our contemporary world. But for the sake of ourselves, we also need to think those things through, to critique them, to find the truth underneath the surface. All of which is to say, the only thing that would really remedy the problems of the bourgeoisie, and I mean this especially in the universities, right, the place that you live and that I live, in any deep way is liberal education. The example of places like St. John's is a gift. Whether the bourgeoisie have the wits to accept it is another question. Thank you.